Welcome everyone to my Trigger guide. Trigger is the newest stunner in the game and has the ability to stun enemies from off-field. In this guide, I will go over Trigger's kit and explain what she does, her playstyles, drive disc sets, stats, W engines, teams, and finally, Mindscapes. And without further ado, let's go over Trigger's kit. Trigger is an S-rank electric stun agent from the Obol squad faction. She performs the role of an off-field stunner and sub-DPS. Trigger's core skill enhancement bonus increases her base attack and impact. Trigger can deal off-field aftershock damage and stun enemies. To deal this off-field damage, Trigger consumes her purge points, which can be indicated through this bar. The purge gauge goes up to 100 points, and you can easily fill it up by holding Trigger's basic attack. Doing so allows Trigger to enter the sniper stance, where she continuously fires and deals electric damage. Each shot she fires grants 25 purge points. Once you let go of her basic attack, Trigger unleashes a finishing move, dealing a decent amount of daze, and triggering a quick assist to the previous character in your squad. You can also skip this finishing move by simply switching to another character. And because of the way Trigger's quick assist works, you would always want to have your damage dealer come before the trigger. During this stance, you can also move and dodge attacks. Additionally, Trigger can automatically evade an attack and trigger a perfect dodge, dealing a decent amount of daze. The automatic dodge can only happen once every 8 seconds. When Trigger has purge points, if a squad member deals damage through their basic attack, dodge counter, special attack, dash attack, or quick assist, Trigger will launch an attack dealing electric damage and consuming 3 purge points. This damage counts as aftershock damage and can be triggered once every 3 seconds. Trigger has a stronger version of this attack that deals more damage and daze. This stronger attack can be triggered when squad members deal damage through a heavy attack from an X special attack, assist follow-up, or ultimate. This attack will also count as aftershock damage, consumes 5 points instead of 3, and can only be triggered twice every 20 seconds. These off-field attacks consume small amounts of purge points, and you usually wouldn't need to refill her purge gauge except in prolonged battles like in Deadly Assault. Even then, gaining purge points can be done very easily. Trigger also has a special state that she can enter through her X special or ultimate, which allows her to use her off-field attack without consuming purge points. Her X special will deal electric damage, trigger a quick assist to the previous character, and allow her to enter the coordinated support state. During this state, Trigger can unleash her off-field attack without consuming purge points and ignoring the 3-second cooldown of the attack. This state lasts for 8 seconds, and up to 4 attacks can be unleashed. Repeated uses will extend the duration and number of attacks. Trigger's ultimate will do much of the same, dealing electric damage, triggering the quick assist, and also allowing her to enter the coordinated support state. However, this time it lasts for 12 seconds and allows up to 6 attacks. Moving on to her core skill, when Trigger deals aftershock damage to an enemy, the stun multiplier increases by 35% for 5 seconds. Trigger deals aftershock damage through her off-field attacks, and as long as you have purge points, you should be able to keep the stun damage multiplier on the enemy. Trigger's stun damage multiplier isn't the regular stun damage multiplier that allows you to deal more damage when the enemy is stunned. Trigger's stun damage multiplier is a special multiplier that applies even if the enemy is not stunned. This means that whatever bonus stun damage multiplier Trigger has on the enemy will apply to all of your attacks, whether the enemy is stunned or not. And lastly, her faction bonus, which requires an attack agent or an agent with the same electric attribute, increases the daze dealt by her off-field aftershock attacks by 1.5% for every 1%, crit rate over 40%. A maximum of 75% daze can be gained this way, which would require 90% crit rate. Moving on, Trigger's skill level priority would be to first level up her core skill and basic attack, as the days and damage from the off-field attacks scale with the basic attack level. Then, you can level up her skill and ultimate. Her assist and dodge can also deal a decent amount of days, so you can level them as well. Trigger is a stunner who has the ability to stun enemies from off-field. The way her purge points and off-field aftershock attacks work makes her a pretty easy unit to play, unlike someone like Pulchra, where you have to manage her little Dorito chips to keep triggering the off-field attacks. Trigger also has a very unique stun damage multiplier, which is more so a consistent buff to your damage, whether or not the enemy is stunned, which is not something other characters do. In comparison to Qingyi, who is also an electric stunner, Qingyi's stun damage bonus is greater, but it requires you to stun the enemy. Trigger's own aftershock damage can also contribute to team damage. Since her faction bonus promotes building crit rate on her, she would already be dealing decent damage, and with someone like Soldier Anby, who buffs squad members' aftershock damage, Trigger's personal damage becomes even greater. Compared to Pulchra, who is also an off-field stunner, Trigger can deal more damage, stun faster, and has a universal damage buff that can be applied even if the enemy isn't stunned. Trigger's off-field attacks won't be able to stun an enemy as quickly as Qingyi or other stunners, but they will allow your damage dealer to be on-field more often. This may not matter for all attack agents, especially those who can unload all of their damage in a stun window, like Zhu Yuan, but for characters like Soldier Anby, who needs to build up the silver star mark, being on field instead of your stunner would be more beneficial. With other attack agents, a bigger buff like Qingyi's might be better, but the benefit of being able to stun enemies from off-field and keeping your damage dealer on-field can also make gameplay easier and more comfortable. Overall, Trigger is a decently strong unit who brings a lot of off-field damage, stuns enemies without taking up on-field time, and even grants a damage buff whether the enemy is stunned or not. If you already have a stunner like Qingyi or even Caesar, Trigger may not be entirely worth it, and even in Trigger's best team with Soldier Anby, the difference between these units is not huge, and for more specialized stunners like Lycon or Lighter, Trigger won't be as good in such teams, but should still be decent. And for what she does, Trigger is very strong. As usual, you should pull for whoever you like. Moving on to drive disc sets, the best option to increase days buildup would be the 4-piece Shockstar Disco set, which increases impact and days dealt by basic attacks, dash attacks, and dodge counters. This should also affect the days from her off-field attacks. I do want to note that the DPS shown in this calculation can be a bit misleading if you're comparing the drive disc sets. This ranking is based on how much days is being applied. The more days you have, the faster and more often the enemy can be stunned. The DPS shown here does not properly account for that. The 4-piece Shadow Harmony set will give Trigger more personal damage in exchange for slightly less days. This should also be a decent option, only a bit behind Shockstar Disco. Protopunk can also be considered due to Trigger's quick assists and is not that far off. As for 2-piece drive disc sets, alongside the 4-piece Shockstar Disco set, the 2-piece Woodpecker set for the bonus crit rate should be the best option to allow Trigger to reach the 90% crit rate threshold in her faction bonus, which should translate into more days. The 2-piece Shadow Harmony set or Thunder Metal set for the electric damage bonus should be decent options if you don't need the crit rate. If you're running a 4-piece Shadow Harmony or Protopunk set, going for a 2-piece Shockstar Disco set for the bonus impact should be slightly better than going for bonus crit rate. As for main stats, for your 4th partition, crit rate should be the best option. Trigger's faction bonus converts crit rate into more days, and to reach the maximum effect, you would need 90% crit rate. 90% crit rate is a lot, and can be difficult to achieve, especially considering that Trigger does not have a crit rate bonus, and stun W engines don't usually come with crit, so you do want as much crit rate as possible, and it also allows her to deal more damage. For your fifth partition, electric damage bonus should be the best option, but going for pen or attack can also be fine, especially if it ends up giving you more crit rate. And lastly, for your last partition, impact is the best option to stun enemies as fast as possible. As for substats, you again want to prioritize crit rate, then you can go for crit damage, attack, and pen. Trigger is built as a sub DPS with offensive stats, and a focus on crit rate for her faction bonus. Moving on to W engines, again the DPS ranking here can be a bit misleading and should only be used to directly compare team buffs provided by the W engines. More days should be better most of the time, but in this calculation, having slightly more days may not always make a difference, since it would take about the same number of attacks to stun the enemy. W engine effects, such as more energy, therefore allowing an extra X special, or just buffs to Trigger's personal damage, might make the team DPS slightly higher. Spectral Graze is Trigger's signature W engine and her best in slot. This W engine has a base attack of 713 and increases crit rate by 24%. Stun W engines don't usually have crit rate, so having crit rate on her signature W engine will help you reach the 90% crit rate target. As for the rest of the effects, when an aftershock deals electric damage, the target's defense will be reduced by 25% for 5 seconds. If the equipping character is not the active character when this happens, 1 stack will be gained, increasing impact by 4% for 12 seconds. Up to 3 stacks can be gained, and once 3 are achieved, impact is increased by a further 8%. This W engine grants crit rate, which makes building crit rate on Trigger much easier. The defense reduction effect on this weapon is very strong and much stronger than effects like the damage bonus from W engines, such as Qingyi's. Without this W engine, reaching 90% crit rate would be very difficult. However, you don't need to hit the 90% crit rate target, and using other W engines should be fine, although admittedly, her signature W engine does make her a much better unit. Qingyi's W engine should be a strong pick. Assuming that the effect can trigger from off-field, Trigger should be able to activate the team-wide damage bonus without great difficulty. The Restrained is another decent option, as it gives more impact, days, and increases basic attack damage. Box Cutter, Pulchra's signature W engine, should also be a decent A-rank option. Even though Trigger isn't dealing physical damage, the bonus days is a strong effect to have. Precious Fossilized Core increases how much daze is being inflicted based on the target's HP. This is a decent option for most stunners, including Trigger, and can also be obtained from the W engine store. You can also use the S-rank W engine, Hellfire Gears, if you already have it. The bonus impact and energy are strong effects. Steam Oven also increases energy and even impact. The difference between Box Cutter, Precious Fossilized Core, and Steam Oven is marginal, and any of these are decent A-rank W engines to have on Trigger. 6 Shooter, the Battle Pass W engine, doesn't really do much as it increases impact and days inflicted by an X special. You can use it, but other A-rank W engines provide more benefits. Damara Battery grants an electric damage bonus and a bit of bonus energy. Aside from the increase to Trigger's personal damage, other A-rank W engines are usually better options. Going for a W engine solely for its crit rate stat isn't all that much better than stun W engines, and I usually wouldn't recommend it. Moving on to teams, Trigger is a stunner who would usually be paired with attack agents, and agents who prefer to stay on field would benefit from having Trigger as their stun agent. Soldier Zero Anby is the prime example, where her best team would be with Trigger and a support, like Astra. You could also go with Pulchra to stun enemies even faster. Harumasa, an electric attack agent, should also be decent with Trigger, although I wouldn't expect this team to perform better than with Qingyi. Other attack agents like Evelyn or Ellen can potentially benefit from staying on field, but in such teams, Lighter or Lycon, in the case of Ellen, will usually be slightly better. However, these teams should still be very competitive with Trigger, especially with Evelyn, where you can build up the Burning Tether points. With Zhu Yuan, you can run Trigger, although having a unit like Qingyi, who can stun faster and provide a greater buff during the stun window, is usually better. However, Trigger will still be strong, especially with her signature W engine. Aside from the attack, stunner, and support team archetype, you could also run a double stun team, such as the Soldier Anby, Trigger, and Pulchra team. Such a team with other attackers could also work with an on-field stunner, such as Qingyi. In this team, enemies will be stunned faster, and the stun damage multiplier will be even greater. Since anomaly units need time to build up their attribute anomaly, running Trigger should be great in theory. However, most anomaly agents would prefer having a second anomaly to trigger disorders, alongside a support. Moreover, Trigger's faction bonus requires an attack agent or an electric agent, so it may not always be viable to run such teams. Although with an electric anomaly like Yanagi, you could possibly play her with Trigger, and alongside a second anomaly, support, or defense agent such as Caesar or Seth. Moving on to Mindscapes, Trigger's M1 will increase the stun damage multiplier from her core skill by 20%. This should apply even if the enemy isn't stunned. Additionally, it will reduce the cooldown of her off-field aftershock attack to 2 seconds instead of 3. Purge gained during the sniper stance is increased by 25%, and the points limit is increased to 125. Overall, a very strong M1 and her best Mindscape in terms of supporting ability. M2 will increase squad members' crit damage by 6% for each attack in the sniper stance. Up to 4 stacks of this effect can be accumulated, lasting for 10 seconds. Trigger will gain 2 stacks of this effect when she executes the finishing move. M3 and M5 increase skill levels, which also increases days inflicted. M4 will activate when Trigger enters coordinated support mode through her X special or ultimate, during which each off-field attack triggered will deal additional damage and days. With this Mindscape, you can use the 4-piece Shadow Harmony set to increase Trigger's personal damage, which will also increase team DPS. And lastly, M6. When Trigger enters combat, she gains 5 armor break rounds. She can also gain up to 5 more rounds for every 25 purge consumed. During the sniper stance, Trigger can use these armor break rounds to deal additional electric damage equal to 1,200% of attack, with this damage being further increased by 50%. Overall, Trigger has very strong early Mindscapes, especially M1, which significantly boosts her supporting abilities and allows for faster stuns. With M4 and M6, building her as a damage dealer also becomes much more viable, benefiting both team DPS and her personal damage. But as always, her Mindscapes aren't necessary, and Trigger is strong enough at M0. Thank you for making it to the end, and thank you for watching.